Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming out. Before these lovely people begin with their discussion, I just wanted to send out a message for everyone about the glass room. So as you know, this is the big glass room San Francisco. There's actually another smaller version that's more accessible, portable, and we've been doing this the past few years. Actually, this year there's already been 60 in about 30 different countries. And we're going to continue to do this, and it's for libraries, schools, or any other host of different organizations that want to bring a little bit of this to their space. And so if you're interested in doing that, please write to us at events@tacticaltech.org. And this will go to the Glassroom team, and we'll get back to you and see how we can set you up. And yeah, I think that's it.
And please silence your cell phones. Thanks.
Oh. Good one.
Hi there, I'm Sidney Fussell. I'm a staff writer at The Atlantic covering technology, and thank you all for coming to the, what's the name of today's event? Tech Worker Movement. Oh. From the tech boom to tech clash, how can tech workers organize? Thanks for joining us, and happy Halloween for the people who are dressed up in Halloween costumes, with one right here. Yeah, so, okay, sorry, suddenly couldn't read my notes. Thanks for coming today. Right, so we're here today to talk about what's been going on recently in terms of different worker movements. I'm here with 3 different experts talking about some of the recent news events that have happened as it relates to tech worker movements. There's been an enormous and remarkable increase in social engagement, collective action, and ethical reflection by workers at giant companies like Facebook, Amazon, Apple, and Google. There's been a lot of protests and a lot of collective action at companies like Amazon, Microsoft, GitHub around, for example, military drone contracts, Chinese state censorship, climate change, and there's several more examples that we'll get to at our experts will be able to get to. And so I want to start by introducing the people we have on the panel to sort of talk about how tech workers are working through and thinking about the ethical ramifications of the things that they create and the things that they're seeing in their own community and their own cultures at their places of work. Right here over the left, we have Joe Ravano Barros. Correct? He's a campaign manager at the Worker Agency, where he works on various campaigns involving tech ethics and migration. He's been helping organize Mehente's No Tech for ICE campaign, targeting Palantir and other companies that contract with ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, for more than a year. And he's a former reporter who lives here in San Francisco. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
So just to sort of start off, as it relates to ICE, there's a lot of, ICE has been sort of like the starter of the catalyst of a lot of different worker movements. Amazon, GitHub, which is owned by Microsoft, and then I think maybe Amazon, GitHub, and Microsoft, a lot of different companies, a lot of workers at these different companies have recognized that there are companies working with ICE and things like that. And I realized that you guys have started a campaign to sort of like organize those people who are frustrated by that link between them. And so can you tell us a little bit about that work?
Yeah, so I think after the Trump election, a lot of tech workers in particular started realizing, I mean, ICE has existed for a long time, and it was doing terrible things under Obama. I mean, Obama was the deporter-in-chief, and ICE was leading workplace raids then, and it was deporting and jailing kids under Obama as well. But really under Trump, I think tech workers started to understand that ICE was being weaponized in a new way and started to look at the contracts that their companies held with ICE and started organizing against these. And we work with Mehente, which is a Latinx organizing group, and the impacted, undocumented people have been organized against ICE for a long time. And Mehente wanted to do a campaign really putting pressure on tech companies that have ICE contracts in order to cancel those contracts. And the rationale is that we can't move the current administration. Targeting DHS is not going to work under Trump, and so we need to go after targets that are movable, and that includes corporations and includes tech companies. And that's immediate harm reduction. I mean, if these companies cancel these contracts, that means that ICE is slowed down, and it's fewer people are deported and fewer people are detained. So for the last year or so, Mahente has been doing a No Tech for ICE campaign. We've been targeting Palantir in particular, but also Amazon, Salesforce, which has a contract with Customs and Border Protection. Other company, GitHub, has a nice contract. And the rationale behind Palantir was that their tech is mission critical to ICE, according to the government's own documents. And they're very visibly an ICE supporter. And so targeting them and kind of generating pressure, educating people about what Palantir does leads to people starting to question how other tech companies are supporting ICE in different ways.
What are some recent victories in that campaign?
Yeah, so we started out a year ago last summer, and we were doing things like bringing a cage to Burning Man so that the tech workers at Burning Man would start to make these connections, and releasing research so that people would understand this is the actual contract that Palantir has with ICE, this is what it does, this is how much it's worth. It was a lot of public education for the first 6 months or so. Recent victories have been in June, the Privacy Law Scholars Conference, which is a big conference at Cal, dropped Palantir as a sponsor. Recently, Lesbians Who Tech dropped Palantir as a sponsor. Grace Hopper, the biggest women in computing society in the world and the biggest conference for that, dropped Palantir as a sponsor. In September, we had over 2,400 students across the country at 30 different campuses pledge that they would not work at Palantir. So that's Cal, Stanford, Brown, Harvard, all these colleges that have sometimes make tens of thousands of dollars a year from special recruitment contracts that they have with Palantir and other tech companies. Students at these campuses said they will not work with Palantir. So those are some of the recent victories, and we've had direct actions outside the headquarters, a lot of articles written. We've really changed. I mean, Palantir has become tobacco now. Like, people know what Palantir does. They understand that if you have an ethical bone in your body, you don't want to work at Palantir. And we've really, that was far less known a year ago and a year and a half ago. So those are some of the recent victories, yeah.
Got it. When we talked earlier, one of the things that you said that I thought was really interesting was that although there's been a big surge over the past year and a half or 2 years as it relates to tech worker movements, you were really adamant about contextualizing this in terms of worker movements in Silicon Valley that reach back several decades. So you thought it was really important that people realize this isn't something that just started a year or two ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's important. Certainly, national attention and kind of popular attention has been on tech worker organizing in particular since the Trump election. And I think that there is a big increase in tech worker organizing and in labor organizing in general. I think 2018 had the most labor strikes, or most, not strikes just, but most worker mobilizations since the 1980s. So there is an actual measurable uptick, and tech workers are a part of that. But tech workers, in the 60s in France and Italy were organizing alongside more blue-collar workers who were working in factories making microchips. People working in Silicon Valley microchip factories were organizing in the 90s, and often their white-collar colleagues would join those strikes and join those protests. So I think it's important to, tech workers should understand that there is a long, storied history here. They can plug into that history. They can kind of learn about what was happening with computer people for peace in the 1960s who were organizing against, in the 70s, organizing against Vietnam and organizing against the work of that their industries did for the military. And that's part of the tradition of Google workers organizing against Project Maven, the drone targeting program of the US military, and making sure that Google did not follow through on that contract. So it's just, I think it's critical to have that history so that you know that you are not alone in this. People have done this before and actually have things to teach you about how organizing can work.
Thanks so much, Joe. Next to Joe, we have Jack Poulson. He's the executive director of Tech Inquiry, a nonprofit focused on empowering tech workers with concerns about the fundamental rights and impacts of their work. Jack was previously an assistant professor of mathematics at Stanford and a research scientist in Google's research and machine intelligence division. Tech Inquiry, it was largely motivated by his campaign to prevent Google from forfeiting human rights protections for dissidents and journalists in China. So you were at Google, something happened, and then you decided that it was more than you could handle. Can you tell us about the work you were doing, what happened to make you leave, and the founding of Tech Inquiry?
Yeah, as a bit of setup, so I had been in Silicon Valley for a number of years, like when I was a professor, when I started at Google for about a year, but then for family reasons to support my partner, I needed to move up to Canada. So before that time, I'd kind of been involved in, some labor movements here. There was an earlier movement called Tech Solidarity, which kind of died out, but kind of seeded the transition in some ways that of concern over the Muslim ban, which I think was maybe a kind of segue to some of the things that Joe just talked about. But once I ended up in Toronto, I was largely isolated. So I was in a sales office in Toronto where most of the engineers were in Waterloo, and we all kind of hid and stood under the radar, because if anybody in Waterloo knew we were there, they'd force us to go to Waterloo. So there were only 4 of us, and then Maven kind of passed me by without me really taking part of it. I'd been kind of in defense contracts as an assistant professor, not really by choice, for a while, and kind of stood back. But then when news broke that Google was reversing its very public stance to protect dissidents and refused to clarify, that was a pretty big deal. And I think one thing that I would tie in is that ideally that you get to meet face-to-face with people that also care about the issues you have, which is a big part of organizing. Maybe the most fundamental is establishing that trust, but not everybody has that luxury. Like if you're in a remote office, how do you build trust? That's a lot more difficult. You might kind of get locked out of your network, especially when security concerns over leaking might ramp up. So the path I ended up taking was more, how can I kind of use the way that you'd negotiate getting a raise to negotiate an ethics issue. So repeatedly within my career, I've had to do very high stakes negotiations, like whether it was, when I moved to Stanford, they had promised they'd help my partner get a job, and then they reneged, so I had to say I'd quit, and then they got them the job. When I was moved to Canada at Google, they tried to have my salary working the same job, so I said no, so they gave me my full salary. But so like understanding that if you put your job on the line, you qualitatively change what sorts of concessions they make was something that was very real to me. So when I saw that they refused to clarify their ethical stances, I realized, well, okay, well, I can put my job on the line here too, and I can say, well, unless you, clarify whether you'd say, protect journalists or refuse to censor human rights, well, how about, if you don't clarify, then I'm out. And I found that did get me some more access, but I learned a lot in the process of what you might assume is sort of an actual debate is really a power struggle where they're trying to get you to just stop. So along that process, they offered me vacations, they offered me a raise, they sort of threatened if you speak to the press, you can't ever come back here. And I think that process taught me that, and watching other movements, that really you need to build power. And I think that's where I tie things into like what Joe's talking about. What you learn over time is that you build power through building trust through large groups of people, so that when you have this moment, when you really care about an issue, those people trust you enough that they'll stand up with you. And when enough people stand up, you actually have safety too. Because who are you going to retaliate if 200 people walk out? You're not going to fire everybody. So I think yes, you can make a splash if you speak out, but ultimately that might get you a few press cycles. And what are these companies good at except for waiting out press cycles and then jamming their own kind of PR down everybody's throat? And I think tech companies are getting smarter, and we shouldn't assume that they're not going to build better PR responses. My hypothesis is that their response over time is going to lean in more to healthcare and AI and humanitarian aid, which we can see in India. And they're going to start building up their own narrative that if you don't give them these powers, then you're actually costing people their lives. And so I think we should maybe over time trust the press less, actually, as a way of keeping these companies in check.
Interesting. So
I still love the press, but I mean, there's a core notion like build power, not build press strategies. And I think, yes, absolutely make things public when they're upsetting, but don't depend on the press for your organizing strategy. Right. If you're isolated and you resign and you're loud, fundamentally the press is your weapon. Whereas if you build power in 100, 200 people, that'll shut down a company. Like that's something that frightens them. It isn't something that shames them. And shame does not override a multi-billion-dollar business deal, which is what I learned.
Got it. So a big part of this, though, is with Tech Inquiry, you want to connect workers with nonprofits. And so it seems sort of interesting to sort of say, well, you need to build power, and then the way you do that is you go after these trillion-dollar companies with nonprofits where they're smaller, they have fewer resources. Like, how do you sort of like do both?
So I don't think of like the nonprofit as the key. Like the way I think about it is, like there's a tension, which is you need people who have expertise for them to have an audience and to have standing, like if you speak out. But also, the more expertise you have, the more of a conflict of interest you tend to have. Like if you're an executive on the extreme end, you're not even allowed to criticize the company more. Like it's your job to say what you're told, like the talking points. Like that's your responsibility. And so there's a balance, which is that rank and file tech workers, I think, are in a sweet spot to where they can speak to the details, in fact, better than the executives. But their conflicts of interest aren't so extreme that they would never actually critique the company. And so, I don't see nonprofits as actually like a solution to why tech workers are better able to speak out. I think of it as like, if you are at a tech company and you're temporarily willing to lift your conflict of interest by leaving that tech company and spend some time outside of the institute, you've still got the halo of the expertise from having been in the company. And so you have that standing, but you also decreased your conflict of interest enough to where maybe you're trusted more and you're sort of free to speak about things you wouldn't have otherwise been able to speak about. So it's not so much the institution so much as you always need some affiliation. And really the only reason I created Tech Inquiry in the first place was I can't just speak. Like I'm not just going to have my name. You want to start building something, and you need to tell people what you stand for, and then other people may want to join, and you start building out kind of a mission.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jack. And then next we have Sherry Wong. Sherry Wong is a Turkish-Hawaiian artist and founder of Icarus Salon, an art think tank researching the ethics of emerging technology. In 2019, she was a resident at the Rockefeller Foundation Bellagio Center, thematic month on AI, a jury member at Ars Electronica for the European Commission STARTS Prize, and partnered with the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University to create Fluxus Landscape, a map of 500 actors in AI ethics and governance. She advocates for justice in AI and pushes for more active roles for artists in academia, industry, and government. Currently, she's working on a counter-narrative AI policy observatory. Sherry, thanks for coming in. You have, what are you wearing? What's going on?
Andy Warhol.
Well said, excellent. So your background is in art, specifically working through like conceptual art and performance art. That maybe to me and maybe other people in the audience seems sort of like a far bridge from technology. So how do you think about it, this connection between art and technology, specifically this project we have now with reshaping or reworking emerging technology and the way that technology is affecting like people that are minoritized or marginalized, et cetera?
So artists have a different perspective, right? And right now we have a lot of engineers who are trying to solve this problem because we have a pushback in the tech world. And we have civil society. And I come from a place of like, hey, we kind of need everybody and we need all these perspectives. And as an artist, I think of things visually. So I kind of see like emerging technology as like this big sort of shape. And then all around it are different perspectives. And coming out of them, there's sort of like patterns of perspectives, like a pattern going diagonal. So an artist pattern goes like that way. And an engineer pattern is this way. And an activist civil society person's this way, the media, like a farmer, like all sorts of different people. And when you have patterns crossing over, you have an interference pattern that happens. So when you have a combination of perspectives, and that you get a new, different type of perspective that never existed before. And I think in there, and that combination is where we have solutions that we haven't tried. Because I think of the ongoing conversation as the same conversation that we've like always had, the Industrial Revolution, the union pushbacks with that, and what's going on now. And combining all that stuff, like, we need to be a little bit different from how we've worked before. You know, we've never been able to catch up. Things have been slow. How are we going to have policy that's going to move fast enough to keep up with tech, right? But if we bring all these like different perspectives in, then it'll work. And as an artist, or as any artist, musicians included, filmmakers, people from pop culture, like conceptual artists, they're just all going to get a different slice. And an artist can speak individually and uniquely to a different type of person. And I think because of this, artists are able to like weave together different aspects of society. So artists work with different mediums, right? Like music or whatever. And they also work in different sectors. They combine different stories. They have different histories that they work with, and they weave it. And as they like migrate from one idea to another, they bring it into the other one. And that also brings together like other voices that are not necessarily included, right? So you've got often like the people who are left out of the conversation, marginalized people, but people that are not just not part of government even, just like everybody gets left out of policy making. And artists can bring them back into the conversation and show why those voices are relevant.
Awesome. Awesome. So one of the things that you work on is a counter-narrative AI policy observatory, which is what you've represented visually, sort of like similar to this metaphor you've been talking about, like different patterns, stuff like that. Can you sort of explain to us what that is? And then sort of like what role do you think the workers within the company, specific, I know it's important to bring in lots of different people, but specific to the workers in that company, where do they fit into this larger conversation about, you know, patterns and things like that?
Okay, so I'm going to reverse that question, start with the worker part. So my previous project, Fluxus Landscape for Stanford, was a visual network map where each organization or activist or artist was represented by a node and connected by their activities and their subject matter in artificial intelligence, ethics, and governance. So represented on there was Mihita and Tech Inquiry, right? Because what I was doing was broadening that landscape. Because until that, and I was like, I saw your thing before you even like announced it, because I was following it so closely. But it's broadening the landscape because like a few years ago when ethics first started coming up into the press, and people only like maybe 3 years ago started talking about AI in government, right? And it's just gone into this hype cycle. So as it was growing, people were only looking at certain sectors. You had to be in big tech or in government to be considered working in AI governance or ethics. So I wanted to be more inclusive and widen that. So I included worker movements. I included like the Google Walkout group in that map as a node that was just as strong, the same size as Google. Because what I was trying to say is that we don't really have a shared understanding of what ethics is or what AI even is. And we're all sharing these words, but we might actually be in opposition to each other. And I included Mihita because I had seen that on their blog posts. They were writing a couple of things against Palantir, and then they started more and more working against it. And it was sort of on the early front, but I think when you include all those different voices, then you get like a more realistic picture that's inclusive of everybody else's opinions on like what's going on in big tech. Oh, and then, so the next project based on that is the observatory, which is going to be a counter-narrative, because we have observatories coming out of the European Union and the OECD and a few other of the major groups that are government organizations. They're going to do the typical same thing they've always done, which is show the world through an index, quantified. These are the important government projects that are in AI, and these are like the civil society groups that are working on it, like Partnership on AI or AI Now. These are major groups, But what gets left out are these other narratives, qualified things, and stories from all over the rest of the world too. Not Europe, not America, and even China gets left out, even though they're like a big player in this. We don't really hear their stories, and we only hear one type of that story. So I'm going to try to represent these more like outsider perspectives.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andy. So I want to sort of open up today's conversation going off exactly what you're saying about how is it that you bring in different people that maybe aren't included in this conversation. And sort of at the policy level right now, specifically in California, there's a large conversation about what exactly is a worker and what exactly is a tech worker. If you're not familiar, Assembly Bill 5 was recently passed by the governor of California, which is a reclassification effort to turn independent contractors and freelancers and have them represented as workers. And so that, the bill was passed, but we're still in a situation where hundreds of thousands of people across all these different apps, be it food delivery, babysitting, delivering laundry, checking code, all across the industry, aren't treated like real workers. And so I was wondering if we could open this up and you guys say, how do you organize and uplift and work with those people when you're in this moment of they're not considered, as important, frankly, as an engineer or a senior researcher, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, so I think it's worth kind of tying it to analogies in other areas. So I've been in Toronto for the last 2 years. One of the first things I did when I moved there was get involved in their Fight for 15 movement, which successfully won something that was called Bill 48 in Ontario that raised up to what was supposed to be $15 an hour in the beginning of 2019, as well as winning the equivalent of AB 5, which shifted the onus onto the employer to prove that someone's an independent contractor as opposed to the other way around. Unfortunately, the moment there was a change in government, that was rolled back. And so now it's back. And so unfortunately, that rollback happened before the tech worker movement in Toronto kind of kicked into gear. So for a long time, no one was willing to help the couriers start to organize there. And finally, a union stepped in, Cup W, and did an incredible campaign, really good media. And they've actually got a vote to unionize going on right now. And of course, the very first thing that Foodora said was, well, you're not actually employees, so you have no right to vote to unionize. And so it was exactly that rollback that blocked it. And so I think it's an incredibly important analogy to draw is just how critical something like AB 5 is, and that if it isn't happening, it's immense.
I think also, so we work with Gig Workers Rising, which is a coalition of, a bunch of Uber and Lyft drivers and other app-based drivers organizing, trying to improve working conditions and organizing for AB 5 before it passed. It's incredibly difficult to organize app-based drivers because there is no workplace. You don't naturally talk to each other. I mean, the organizers who were able to add hundreds of drivers to their lists and really get them to turn out, they were going to SFO airport parking lots and going car to car, trying to get everyone on board, doing a lot of online organizing. I know online organizing is kind of pilloried often for not being real, and you need face-to-face time, and face-to-face time is really important. But how are you going to do Uber and Lyft organizing except online? There is no one is meeting face-to-face anywhere. So you need the online component. And I think what was often critical for Uber and Lyft drivers to organize or how to win a lot of power was just getting their stories out in the media and changing their narrative about what it's like to drive for Uber and Lyft. So drivers sleeping in cars, that, if you go out to Ocean Beach, there are entire parking lots on Friday and Saturday nights where it's 200 cars and it's just Uber and Lyft drivers from Fresno and Sacramento who drive down to San Francisco for the weekend, stay overnight, make money, and then drive back up. It's getting those stories out in the media and getting people aware of those. And then legislators are paying attention to those stories and then pushing whatever legislative changes they're doing. Making sure people understand that driving for Uber and Lyft means that you don't get to take bathroom breaks often. You have to work your life around that, something that people don't really conceive of or don't think about. So a lot of, when you have this asymmetry in power, you're not a real employee, you don't have a central place to organize, you have to be creative about how you're gonna get your message out there. And I think one of the key things that we've noticed was really showing what is the day-to-day life of workers in this new gig economy. trying to win like actual legislative changes then as a result of that narrative shift.
So, I mean, the key word is always solidarity, and that's solidarity between the engineers and also all the other workers too. Because there's sometimes we'll talk about these things as if it's like one big group, but there's a big division in Silicon Valley. So, like contingent workers are what, like 50% of every company, or contract workers, and they just don't have the same rights. And then you have the contract workers who come in, who work in cafeterias, and who drive the buses. And they're not often included in some of these like groups that walk out. One group that does include them is the Tech Workers Coalition, and you should follow them on Twitter, Tech Workers Co. They're really great, and because that was formed by an engineer and I think a cafeteria worker, if I'm correct. But so they believe in solidarity between rank and file, and that's when you build strength, because power is always trying to like make you think that you're divided and split up, and that's not true. But there's also power internationally. I was in Brazil recently, and my Uber driver was super excited about the California bill that passed, because he was like, oh, maybe it'll trickle over here, because their government had voted on the exact opposite and had said that, you know, in Brazil, Uber workers cannot have any sort of rights or insurance at all, that they're not workers. So they were hoping that maybe a change in the company, because they had to like change to, you know, fit in with California, might trickle out internationally. And I was like, no, I hope so too, you know. One of the things that we've seen that works for online organizing, to your point, was with Mechanical Turk. There was an online forum called Dynamo that was made by a Stanford professor and an academic named Lily Irani, and it was a worker organizing platform specifically, not just a chat thing. They researched, did academic research on like what the pain points were, like where the frictions were, and they tried to solve it. And that worked really well for pushing for like higher pay raises and stuff in Mechanical Turk.
Yeah, there was an ironic end to that story. So Lily said that when she finally closed that project down, Amazon reached out to her and asked if she would continue. And it turned out that it had actually been doing Amazon a favor, because it was effectively giving the workers more confidence in using the platform. So, I mean, it could have been a symbiotic relationship. It's not clear that it was a loss, but I thought that's, you know, an interesting angle on, you know, what might seem adversarial might not always be.
I think it's interesting that I actually haven't seen as much worker solidarity that you're talking about as like. What, you know, between contract workers and full-time employees, or between Uber tech workers and Uber drivers, like that's something that's totally lacking. And I think one of the few groups was the Amazon workers, kind of the warehouse workers and the Whole Foods workers did walkouts, and there were some white-collar Amazon workers that joined them, but it was still a minority. And like that, I think, is a key missing component of the tech worker organizing that we're seeing, is a lot of kind of walkouts on the white collar side and some on the blue collar side, but like the bridge is still not as strong as it should be.
If I could speak to that point, like the moment that kind of still sticks in my mind before I left to Toronto, I had participated in a city council campaign that was led by Unite Here and Tech Worker Coalition and then Silicon Valley DSA. And the push was for passing legislation which would prevent Intel from changing its contract for food workers and then immediately firing all of the contractors. And I later realized that the reason this was being pushed is that they'd repeatedly done this. Every time there was a vote for unionization, they would flip the contract and fire everyone, and it happened twice. So, you know, at the city council meeting, a huge number of business interests, like contracting agencies, got up and spoke out against the legislation and said, you know, no, these people, you know, I don't know why we're complaining about them needing to find a new job. As a contractor, I can tell you they'll have a job in the next day because I get people hired for this. And so there was a bit of a dynamic that stood out to me, which was, if you don't have tech workers standing up, like white-collar tech workers, then the only white-collar white-collar people who do stand up are against these people. And so you are like, there's a void that you didn't fill And it was your job to stand with these people because people will stand against them. And so, like, having seen that and that a few tech workers did show up and then the bill passed unanimously, that was just an incredible thing to witness. And so I think, yes, like it's our job to stand up because otherwise someone is going to fight them for their interests.
So you mentioned unions, which it sort of seems like one of the things that you all have in common, that you're working with these different third parties, be it nonprofits or worker specific. So do you see, I sort of am trying to sketch two different paths. On the one hand, are you trying to recreate unions or maybe formalize a union, or do you think that that's not the direction we should go on? We should sort of not encourage unionization and set this new path of these, coalitions among these different third parties, or even just internal organizing that isn't formalized in that way?
So I would say that there's a common line or a term people use a lot, which is solidarity unionism. So even in the news, 2 days ago, the American Federal Government Employees Union, huge amounts of concerns over, I believe even, sexual harassment. Similarly with United Auto Workers, there was also concern over some fraud happening at a pretty high level. I think there's understanding that when you have a sufficiently large organization where bureaucracy forms, interests can diverge from those of the people being served. And so there's a lot of interest in, well, why do we even need to have an other that's helping us lead this organization? Why don't we just train ourselves to run these campaigns? And so, partly the strategy has been, well, let's just have an arm's length kind of relationship of solidarity with the unions. So I'll host meetings, at union, facilities. Like finding space in practice is one of the hardest things if you're trying to put a group together. And so unions have space. They have, connections to people who can make media, like the campaign for the Foodsters United. The media actually turned out to be one of the most important components. So they put up the posters effectively in all the restaurants all around Toronto. And so local bike shops would show solidarity. And when you started to go down the street and just see this really amazing artwork everywhere, I think people started to realize the power that this group had. And just having a little bit more resources goes a long way. So maybe I waffled a bit, but I think roughly arm's length relationship is where things currently stand.
Yeah, I think unions are great. Definitely, unions are very powerful. It's like you said, whenever there's a large enough bureaucracy, there's going to be divergent interests, and it gets messy and it's hard to navigate. But unions have a lot of power, and unions in this country have been decimated, and so there's I think been a historically kind of toxic view of unions and what they can accomplish that is just not as true in other countries, and you have a more favorable view of unions and what they can do, and that's changing. It's starting to change, but I am always surprised actually that when we a lot of tech workers who are organizing, or even the Uber and Lyft drivers who are organizing, don't necessarily all of them want a union, and the tech workers definitely they talk about other non-union ways of forming solidarity, and I think it's interesting. I think that having a formal union which has certain legal rights that any other kind of organizing group doesn't have is just going to give you more structural power and legal power that you're going to need to have a working relationship with management. And formalizing a workers group as a union is going to give you more leverage than it would otherwise.
Yeah, like in the Mechanical Turk example, in Lily's paper, they had done a survey of all the workers, and they did not want to unionize. I think there's a lot of just a change of what people think unions do or are that's transformed in the past century. They used to have a lot of power, but the efforts to unionize in tech, that was mainly in the 80s and maybe some early 90s, and I can't name them, right? I don't know who they are and what happened to that. It was not successful, I think. But I love unions personally, but I'm just an outside observer. So the only thing I observe is that there's a big challenge to onboard people onto it, because you have the union of unions things too, where you can group people together by their shared common interests and shared goals to push for things, which is going to be missing unless tech workers unionize.
It's funny though, because they've kind of, business has won by us having this conversation in a way where it's are unions good? Do we want unions? Like, well, and we can't name unions that formed in the 80s and 90s, and it's because they weren't able to form because they were decimated and they didn't have the power to form. And now we're even questioning whether unions are useful because we can't name like good things that they've accomplished. Well, that's because business had a targeted attack on unions and they won. And now we're questioning the validity of having unions at all. It's like they've changed the conversation, they've changed the playing field altogether, and now we're like on a different level.
If I could just like make sure I didn't come across as saying I was against unions. The thing I was suggesting is, the question is, what is the form, not is it useful? And there is a serious question of, do you hire people whose only job is to run the thing? Or do you guarantee that the people that are running the thing are like you, and maybe you try and rotate the responsibility. So I read an amazing book called Cokeland by Chris Leonard like a week ago. It's a 600-page book, but it reads really quickly, and it's kind of the rise and fall of unions as told through Coke Industries. And one of the cases is in, I think it's in Atlanta, and one of the points that keeps being brought up is that, it was this worker who was put on, in charge of doing the negotiations, and the problem he kept having is that the workers just assumed that by being in the union and paying the dues, that was their job, and that it was the job of the management to actually do the negotiation. And that's the fundamental failure, is to assume that just by membership, you've done your part. Like your job, like the point of the union is not to do things for you, it's to teach you how to do things better. And so I think as long as that kind of sense can be preserved, I'm all for it. But the question is, how do you do that?
Well, how do you do that, especially considering the antagonism, the intense antagonism that you would read from management? I know that you face this a lot yourself, and we talked a lot earlier about how there's this fear that you'll talk to a journalist or you'll say something in media or whatever. So it's like, when you have that antagonism from up top, how do you sort of like maintain that enthusiasm?
Lots of small wins. Keep people understanding, like when you work together and you actually put energy into something, that you can get something out of it. If there's learned helplessness, I think that's where you end up in these situations where you're kind of alienated from the fact that if you fight for something, you can actually win something.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a union organizer, so I have no idea how to form a union. But I think that's basic. Like, I think it's interesting that a lot of the, say, organizing against Project Dragonfly, which was the censored Chinese search engine, like at Google, that organizing arose because those organizers had been in touch about Project Maven, the drone targeting program, and they had been in touch about some trans issues at Google earlier than that. So like every time you have small wins and you have organizers getting together and just talking about what's happening at work, you start to form fertile ground for larger structural organizing. So that's not specific, it's vague, and I don't know how to form a union, but things like that.
No, that just made me think of how, I believe that sort of thing is actually the secret to changing the world at large. Because if we have those shared communities of fate, as one of my mentors calls it, she's a political scientist, and she researches like unions and how different groups make progress when they don't actually agree. Because I mean, if we look around, right, the world, we have totalitarianism rising, it's like a chaotic, crazy thing, and then the climate change on top of it. So how are we going to actually push for these larger global changes and have collaborative international efforts? It's in the same sort of way that you do with a very small union in a very small place. It's like, okay, we have this one shared goal. We have a community of fate in this thing. We might disagree on all other things, but like, for example, in the sexual harassment in tech, every single female worker knows why they need to band together on that. And it doesn't matter if you're an executive, it's just like it's something that you have in common. So you can band over that, even though you might have totally differing intentions. And I can see that sort of spreading out and being a catalyst for greater change.
Well said. I think we're going to open it up to questions now. Right here.
I can. Thank you. So I work kind of in this field, more specifically related to AI and implications of AI. So I was really curious because, oftentimes it's incredibly difficult or sometimes impossible for tech workers to be aware of the supply chain or the impact of what they're building. And do you think that organizational culture in tech companies prevents people to relate to the impacts of the technology they're creating? And even more so, in a perfect world, what kind of organizational structure and culture changes do you think that needs to happen in order to create the condition where this would be possible?
I mean, to the first part, yes. Like, was it Maven or Dragonfly where like either the Chinese search engine or the drone targeting program at Google, the teams had no idea what they were building. Like they were over here doing this small thing, the other team was over here doing this thing, and then it kind of happened by coincidence where someone was able to like piece it together and was like, oh, this is actually what we're doing, and then the organizing started. So absolutely, management sets things up intentionally to obfuscate what the product is. I don't know what organizational structure, maybe you have ideas on like would be useful to get like how to increase transparency at work.
Yeah, so I've spent a lot of time thinking about this point, and in fact, it was my thesis. I got called in by about 40 senior Department of Defense officials to be a face to a tech worker who does not want to build weapon systems. And the thesis was that civilians have a right to choose whether or not they are going to contribute to systems which might, cause harm or suppress civil liberties. The response was actually, from many of them, was you don't, like, if you don't do that, who's going to do it? Like, why do you think you deserve that right? And I've talked to lawyers about this. Like, I feel like there's a question of what would it mean to win the right to be required to be informed to the point to where you actually even have enough information to make an ethical decision. And ultimately, the conclusion of that conversation is you have to win that through bargaining. And if you're going to win that through bargaining in the contract, that's going to require something starting to look like a union. Maybe if you're like someone who commands very high salaries, you happen to have enough negotiating power to get that. And if you're in a small company, it's a bit easier. When I was dealing with startups, I demanded that sort of access to like be on the board meetings. But at a big company, you either need, you need some power behind you. But I think that's the right way to view this, is that it's something to be negotiated in your contract. Otherwise, they'll lie. Actually, here's one more point. The DoD thought Google was being transparent. It was Google managers that weren't. So the DoD is actually surprisingly transparent about it. In fact, that's how Google workers found out. They just looked up what the DoD said, right? Like, they're pretty open about it being lethal. Now, granted, some senior DoD people don't like for you to argue lethality, even though their own documentation says it. But I would argue that the tech managers are more secretive because they know that there's a reaction if they're honest.
Yeah, some sectors are more regulated than others, but outside of tech, you can also push for transparency through regulation. I don't know what I'm not a policymaker, so I don't know what that would look like, but it shouldn't always be up to the worker. There is a really good art piece that I'm going to recommend. It's called Anatomy of an AI. It's by Kate It's downstairs. Okay, I didn't know that. Downstairs. And it's the supply chain of Amazon Echo, I believe. And, it starts off with the smallest thing. And just like the mining of the minerals and like unethical issues there, unethical issues in the warehouse, and then like the extraction of you as the user and your data. But I think if you see something like that, you can turn anywhere into any sort of job, and you can sort of like expand your view on what that looks like for not Echo, for something else, for your job, for your life, for like the way that you're, using plastics or something. It makes you question other stuff, because that's like the power of art. And I think like I think comic books and pamphlets for stuff like that would be very effective.
Hi, thanks for the panel. So as you all know, there's a lot of risk involved with organizing, and some of you have faced retaliation. And I feel like in today, that's even worse, right? With surveillance capitalism and then increasingly monitored workplaces. There's also a rising trend of digital security guides, in particular aimed at like journalists or sources for journalists or activists working in certain contexts. I'm wondering if you have heard of similar sorts of guides for folks that are trying to organize.
Okay, so I literally spent all morning planning exactly that with an organization. So there's a group called the Signals Network, not affiliated with Signal, the app, sat in the same office as Freedom of the Press. But anyway, so the role that this former Reporters Without Borders person, Delphine Haugen, has played has been supporting whistleblowers who have been litigated against, like Rui Pinto, the football leaks. And so there's an idea we had, which is, well, if there's going to be retaliation, maybe we should have people in the room who know how to actually support people once they're retaliated against. And so there's a coalition I've been trying to put together, and will have put together between Amnesty International and Signals Network and my organization, to try and put together kind of previous case studies of people who have spoken out, for the reason that if we provide advice, that might look like incitement. Whereas if we do analysis on cases that already happened, then we can basically just say, well, this is, this person did not get retaliated against. And so one of the really difficult issues actually is how you talk about NDAs. For the reason that in practice there's much less enforcement than what the law says, for the reason that companies kind of play chicken with you. Like they don't want to look bad by suing someone who is speaking out in public interest. But yeah, roughly speaking, like not using company infrastructure, use Signal, don't use company hardware or software. Like, I mean, none of these things are particularly complicated, but I think it may be worth mentioning.
Thank you. I was wondering on the point of the, I felt a bit that there were two kind of main objectives through the talk of what the unions can achieve. In one hand, better working conditions, demanding worker rights and so on, and in the other hand, problematizing the practices of what the companies are doing. And I am wondering if a lot of the power for coming together as a union emerges from the precarity of certain working conditions, and if that is the spark that puts the group together to unionize, what if those better conditions will be achieved? Will we miss then the power to actually demand better change for the practices of the companies because there is not a ground of unfairness in the working conditions? And even if still that will happen, do we want, let's say, for issues that are affecting us all across the world, not just in the US, do we want just the workers unionizing within these companies to make the decisions of what these companies should be doing? Or should we also have a larger dialogue beyond these unions with the rest of the world on what the practices of the company can be?
So I think history, I mean, if I'm understanding your first question correctly, it's if you're treated sufficiently well, will there be any reason to unionize? And I think what one can observe is that white-collar employees tend to be motivated more by ethical and harassment issues as opposed to like core wage issues. And that was a big point of debate, like in the tech solidarity days, if you will, around the Muslim ban, where it had to constantly be pointed out that there's a reason to unionize even if you think you're paid well enough. And I think that argument doesn't need to be made anymore because people have seen the types of issues that collective action helps you win on. For your second question, that was like, should it only be workers? I think clearly the answer is no. Civil society is critical in these conversations. If nothing else, human rights groups should be played. Even more importantly than human rights groups is bring in the vulnerable. If someone has ever been harmed by one of these technologies, their voice deserves to be heard. Like, adjudication processes, whatever terms you want to put to it, I mean, tech workers, I think, they can speak expertly enough to not be shut down. And what often happens if you only have civil society in the room is a tech person can kind of lure them into a point in the conversation where they get to make an assertion that requires you to have their level of technical expertise in order to continue the argument. And so tech workers are critical to kind of prevent that kind of trap, which I see constantly. Like if a human rights lawyer argued with actually a former EFF person recently, there's kind of easy ways to have technical blockages.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like it's about levels of democratic control at the workplace, and like management controlling decisions is the worst level, and then workers is a greater level, and then actual public is the next level, which is not going to happen, but would be aspirational. And I think that you always need people who have been directly impacted by the technologies that you're building to actually set the tone and do a lot of they almost always have been doing the organizing from before the workers have been doing the organizing, and they should set the pace for that organizing, and they should actually tell you how to do the organizing, because they're the ones that see it every day. Like undocumented people know how ICE is using tech because they see it in their communities. Like one of the reasons why this campaign was launched was because, under Bush, you got kind of mass raids at grocery stores and restaurants, and they would line everyone up and check their IDs. And then all of a sudden, under Obama and Trump, people were coming to your house and coming to your kid's school. And it was like, how did ICE get this data? Like, how do they know where my kid goes to school? And so they understand, and then they start asking questions of how the data flows for ICE, and that then gets Palantir workers interested once there's an external group of credible people who are saying, this is how this tech is influencing me and impacting me, saying this. That allows the internal workers to say, well, look, let's see, like this is how our tech is being used. There's an outside group doing this. There's this outside group putting out the research. So you have the internal, external strategy for how to make change there. Like you need the external groups who are actually being impacted by stuff to give workers who are concerned credibility for this stuff.
Thanks. A question on the helping tech workers who are trying to organize if you're coming from a nonprofit or non-governmental organization. You can connect them with media, you can connect them with legal help, but I always advocate, if tech workers have something to say, we'll help them publish their op-ed and place it. We'll give them speaking opportunities. But in that critical moment when you decide to take a stance and you're like, okay, what do I do now? Like, where do you see the resources that are needed to kind of help you get started?
If I could interject a bit, just in the whistleblowing kind of framing, I think often when I have this discussion, it's surprising how little people talk about collective whistleblowing. There's something about the framing of speaking out that it's almost assumed that you have to be atomized. And so I think I would always suggest providing resources, suggesting to people that you can try and form a coalition with your coworkers, partly for the reason that it's almost, I think of it like an engine that you've built in the company, like that can keep producing press-worthy events, whereas when you speak out alone, it tends to be a little bit more difficult to sustain interest, and you're kind of repeating the same story a lot. But yeah, media training would probably be the first thing, knowing that reporters probably want to cover one thing at a time as opposed to you kind of dumping on them, like, here's the 6 things that I'm concerned about, like understanding what it looks like to sustain a campaign, what a press cycle is, having somebody who's willing to help edit if necessary. I mean, I would say it maybe needs to be a little bit more tailored, but roughly speaking, tapping someone into a network to where they can talk to someone who has the relevant expertise is probably the most important step.
Yeah, even when I was in the art world, I wanted to unionize all the front desk workers. There's this just unfairness, and the lack of justice is a universal thing. And there was a website that was of just the front desk workers complaining, even though it's a very highly prestigious thing, because they get paid absolutely nothing, right? Some of them don't get paid ever because it's such a prestigious job, but. The first thing is you're not alone. So it's just like you make a friend, and then you can do exactly what Jack was saying.
Yeah, I think that's really key. Is like you are not the only one thinking of this stuff at your company. Get 100%. Like if you come out, there will be other people who, like if you post on Slack or if you come out publicly, there will be other people who have your back and who agree with you, and then you'll be able to do the kind of collective whistleblowing or collective action that you need at work. And also, you will almost certainly have a soft landing if you decide to take a dramatic step. Like, I mean, you know this personally. Like, other people will give you a job, or they will fundraise for you, or there's like a tremendous network of very privileged people who are concerned about tech ethics, who will be able to take care of you if something. And at the end of the day, you know, leaving your tech job or not being at work for 2 months is not the end of the world. And I think I understand that it's very difficult to leave your work and take that step, but I also get frustrated because there are, you know, when undocumented people protest against, say, police brutality, like, and if they get arrested, they are deported. Like, that is the line, and they're willing to do that anyway. Like, you have to kind of start thinking about what it's like for the people who you're supposedly advocating for, and then kind of take a bit of courage from them and start working with those people in order to kind of see what the real consequences are for the actions that you're taking. And like, it turns out that the consequences are relatively minor for tech workers in comparison to other things.
Yeah, I would say that a lot of people that I've spoken to have an intense fear of being blacklisted from industry if they speak out. My experience was exactly the opposite. And if you think about it, it makes sense. If you speak out from a place of integrity and it's interpreted as integrity, that's a valuable asset for a company to kind of use you as an ethical shield. So actually, to me, the hard part was my standards are now higher for where I want to work, not can I find work, but do I feel like I'm selling out and kind of cashing in on whatever kind of reputation that I might have earned? And so really, I think that's the catch is like, how do you move somewhere where, you know, you feel like you're actually doing something better than what you were doing before? And that's a hard question. And I think people tend to think pretty deeply about what they do with their life after they speak out on something.
So unfortunately, we do have to wrap it up there, but I did want to say that if you're interested in these issues, which are obviously extremely important, a lot of the exhibits here in the Glassroom do address some of the things we talked about today. The piece Anatomy of an AI that Sherry talked about is downstairs. We also commissioned some artworks. We specifically commissioned a timeline of tech protests. So if you're interested in looking at that, it's downstairs. And we have an entire section of the exhibition dedicated to the invisible labor that goes into making your tech products. So it's a really important discussion to be having, and I feel so lucky that we had the four of you here to talk about it. And thank you so much for sharing your experiences and your knowledge with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen.